All right, good morning, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting of the Community and Economic Development Committee to order. It is Thursday, January 18th, 2024, here at the training room at 4700 Elmore Road. I am Member George Martinez, and I'll ask for Assembly Member introduction.
Kevin Cross.
Anna Brawley.
Zach Johnson.
Are we joined by Assembly members on the phone?
Yeah, Chris Berger.
We have Member Constant and
Karen Bronga.
Bronga and Volan.
Scott Myers is going to be about 5 minutes later.
Excellent. So great. Thank you, members, for joining us on this conversation today. We're going to have basically two items for our continued discussion. One for continued discussion, one is a new agenda item. And just to remind folks, if there are any other projects that folks want to bring forward, talk to us in advance. Before we go into the new business, I just wanted to also remind the departments that the idea of coming up on kind of that dashboard analysis or a quarterly review and what kind of information we want to begin to share with the public is something that I want us to not lose track of as we come up into this coming building season.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to make sure that we recognize that we're going to use some of our time over the next few months to learn, similarly to the way we did with Mr. Robbins coming here and doing some presentations around the use of land trusts and different concepts. So I'm interested in making sure we use that space. And one other thing that I'll just throw out there is to Mr. Lyons and to the staff of this building, I would like to see a project come forward to us for consideration, to the Assembly for consideration to improve the connectivity of this training room or the other similar facility here at the Permit Center. I think the connectivity of having a complete Teams setup similar to 155 is important for both external training needs, but also our transparency and connectivity to the public. Make sure that they're able to keep track of what we do in this work here, which is really important. And I'd like to see a project come forward. I can't imagine it would be so much money that it would be prohibitive. And considering that the Assembly is looking at improving its technological capacity out of the Assembly chambers itself, I think this is an opportunity for us to consider a project, put some funding to improving the sound and the broadcast quality and connectivity out of the Permit Center and possibly this room. So just wanted to put that out there to Mr. Lyons and anyone else who has that ability to think about that and work with us on that project. So I'm stalled enough to make sure that members who are going to lead this, the first part of the conversation, are in queue and ready to go. And so the first order of unfinished business today is a continued discussion of third-party review. That was a robust conversation we had last time.
It's awesome.
Awesome conversation. I could tell that can just explode in all sorts of different directions with respect to opinions and ideas. And so I wanted to make sure that we did keep that on our agenda, and I think we have a few alternative versions that are being presented to us. So if Member Brawley, are you?
I'll start.
Okay, cool. So Member Cross will start this conversation up again.
Yeah, we discussed this at the last CDC meeting, and then I've been having conversations with bringing Anna in as a co-sponsor, and she's done some reviews. And we want to make sure that we were addressing some of the concerns that were around it, making sure that in our intention to try to increase efficiency and reduce those timelines for private developers, that we're not sacrificing any of the safety or any in addressing the concerns from the building department adequately. So Anna has been working on an S version. I had some other things that I was working on, but she's got hers prepared. So, Anna, would you go ahead and share what you've been working on?
Yeah.
Just one moment for the record, Member Myers has joined us in person as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I can be brief. So what I'm looking at is this one-page document. My ideal world, this would have been in an S version. I didn't get there. But what I did was draft kind of the conceptual version of what I would imagine in here. And then I know Member Cross also has an S version. So we haven't had a chance to talk about this. But just to share, so what I understand the problem to be is, especially for this coming building season, concerns about low staffing in this building. And so and I should say too, I'm generally skeptical of proposals to just outsource muni functions, right? So I'm not coming from the position that I want this to necessarily last forever. However, I do recognize we have this as an option. It's presented in residential development or on the residential side to be a way to allow for kind of that peak capacity issue, right? Where if it's hard to get through the muni system, and there's a lot of reviews that this is an option. So what I prepared here is kind of addressing three concerns, and this is for discussion. I wanted to bring it today since we're talking. One is to make it a time-limited program that sunsets. So we talked about that in the last meeting. I think maybe somebody had thrown out 2 years. I was thinking sooner than that, really just over this one building season. And I know the work continues year-round, but knowing that there's the biggest demand in the spring, summer, and probably early fall. So looking at that, looking at making sure that it's third party. So I looked at the language that was in the ordinance, but I thought it could be a little stronger, and also seeing that it was current code, but strengthening it to define not just that someone wasn't working on the project, but also that they don't have an ownership interest in the project, a financial interest, and neither does their immediate family member. And then the other piece is really just an intent language, not a code change, but to say that this is not intended to replace or be the pretext for removing positions within the department, but to augment capacity. So again, making sure that it's not, basically that it's a way that we could test it and then consider whether to extend the sunset or to make it permanent. And so the language that's drafted here, you can go ahead and read it too, but just putting a couple whereas clauses that again say this is where we are. We're concerned about the 2024 season. The intent is not again to replace staff, but to augment. Defining third party with that financial interest language, and then suggesting two sections at the end. One of them is a sunset of November 15th, which could be extended by the assembly, but requires that extension. And then the other one is to require a report to the assembly from the department, not an extensive report, but essentially how many people used this, how many permits went through the regular system with the muni, and then really any other kind of findings or deficiencies. So let's say, a lot of them went through and were found to be deficient or there were problems and had to be redone or things like that. Or maybe there was no issue, so the recommendation might be, yes, this would be good to extend. So it's not a full audit, but really thinking conceptually of like an audit to say, was this program working? Should we extend it further? So that's the idea. And then the language here is really just that conceptual version of that.
We have Mr. Constant in the queue. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. So I haven't been able to follow this issue very closely, but I remember where we were a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when this question was before us. And I continue to maintain my skepticism about a company being able to hire their own reviewers and have everything done basically by their friends. And so for my part, I am still probably chewing on the idea of an amendment that would make it, again, so that it's under the umbrella of the building official and that it's a muni hired individual that the customer obviously has to pay for because it's a service they have. It can be, at least on a temporary basis, in my opinion, a term contract. I just want to make sure that the review process is being done very independently, not just in name independent. So it's hard when you're writing the check to the company doing the work to have a true independent nature because you are in a business relationship. And so I am still chewing on this. I just want to let folks know I'm not convinced yet.
Thank you, Member Constant. Mr. Johnson?
I'm also still skeptical, but I guess just first off to kind of understand what the need is. Now, I'm guessing that for the 24 building season, because it's close, right? That the people who had intent to break ground in 24, we would have seen some of those plans submitted at this point, maybe most, all. I mean, what's typical? What I'm trying to get at is how many projects are in the works for 24? Where are the plans at? And then how many, do we think might be delayed by a year if we don't do this? Does anyone have a take on that?
So,
Please identify yourself for the record.
Greg Soule, Acting Development Services Director. The bottleneck was really at permit intake. We did not have a bottleneck in terms of the processing, plan review, and approval processes. We were understaffed at the permit counter. So, I think that was the perceived bottleneck. We are now almost fully staffed. We have an offer out to our last position to fill. So, I don't see that the permit intake continuing to be problematic, once we get everyone trained up and everything. That's hopeful, I guess. I guess I'll defer to Ross to talk about the plan review because he oversees the plan reviews.
This is Ross Housing, Acting Building Official. Generally, we're still in the slow time of year, and so generally more towards the end of January, things start picking up where the new permits start coming in for construction in 24. And generally, the plan review would reach its peak busyness historically starting in March, running through May. And at this point in time, it looks like the municipality has adequate resources to keep up with workload. We don't anticipate, we've been in a downtrend now for over 5 years. The real question is whether we bottomed or not. Are we going to still head down in terms of construction valuations? But bottom line is that plan review-wise, it looks like we have resources to keep up through the busy time of year.
So is that to say that working under the status quo, that any plans submitted for the 24 building season would not be delayed or prevented from going forward, that we feel with high confidence that we will be able to get them turned around in a timely enough manner?
Yeah, to make this construction season for certain. But someone could submit something that for land use reasons or maybe technical reasons where they do run into some great difficulty, and because of these technicalities they miss a season, but that's not necessarily connected to resources.
Would independent plan review, do anything to address, those challenges if they arise with certain projects?
No, that wouldn't be solved by private plan review.
I guess then, since I don't really see what the harm is in the current way we're doing business, I'm weighing, I understand that it's possible that there may be some risk that a project's delayed, but I'm weighing that against what are the risks in going with independent plan review. And maybe we say, well, we don't think they're too significant, but we seem to at least tacitly acknowledge that they do exist. I see in SS version here, paragraph 4, review plans for any deficiencies, right? That's sort of acknowledging that it's possible third-party plans might have deficiencies, and frankly, once things are built, I think it's rather hard to fix it. Certainly I would expect that to turn into some sort of significant legal battle, just guessing there. So, yeah, in weighing what I feel like are the hazards of kind of sticking with the status quo against the potential hazards of going to this model, I don't know, I'm sort of leaning towards thinking that the system we have in place is adequate, and if we do need more staff, if we do need to look at ways to sort of streamline code to make it more efficient where it's overly onerous, I'm open to that, but I'm still skeptical of this.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Anybody else? No one else is going to.
So, one example of an industry you can look at that functions very well, and we can reflect on it, you would say that new construction home inspections. Many of you have probably purchased a home, or you know that lots of homes are constructed and built. It would probably surprise you to know that the most successful home inspectors in the real estate industry are the ones who are also the most aggressive. Because both the seller and the buyer know that they're going to get an accurate report that is not flawed so that people don't end up in courts. It is not beneficial to either party to have somebody who is not doing their job to a high degree when it comes to inspections, when it comes to these things. Just like architects in Anchorage, the most successful ones are the ones who do a really good job. Chris Cole, go down the list. Those individuals who are extremely proficient and extremely knowledgeable in their job float to the top. That's the way it is with home inspections. And now, oftentimes, when you're getting a VA loan and certain types of financing, Alaska Housing, it absolutely requires that those buildings are inspected. Now, home inspectors obviously have a lower requirement and licensing requirement. The ASA, the American Standard for Home Inspecting Institutes. They still got to go through study. So it's not as aggressive as study background as a structural engineer, but still, we can look at how this is performing in other areas and see that it functions extremely well. The municipality of Anchorage is not going out doing home inspections every time somebody buys or sells a house. They rely on that industry, and it does extremely well. If it didn't, then that industry would come under additional scrutiny by the state licensing requirements, and we would be hearing about it in the newspaper every day. So one is to just look at how this is being applied. Two is, there is honestly two different realities that are existing. There is what these conversations happen inside this building, and then there is the flood of emails that we receive, and when you talk to anybody who's dealing with this bureaucracy. I'm just going to be perfectly honest. Did the other assembly members read the email that came from commercial appraiser Eric Bajorn-Roley? Yeah, there you go. See, he said, thank you for straightening out. I went to high school with him, but I've never been able to say his name. And he provided public testimony and said why he thought this was extremely valuable. And if you didn't get it, I encourage you to go back and reread it. He talks about experiences. He also talks about an HLB parcel he appraised that had negative value because the Title 21 requirements made it almost useless piece of dirt. So if you guys fix these things, you might actually be able to do something, but at this point, you should probably have to pay somebody to take it. But he's provided some testimony. He gave very specific requirements about commercial contractors who won't, and individuals who have either come up to Alaska and looked at it and left, or decided not to build, or the fact that we're 1.3 times longer than the average for cities that are much, much larger. So I understand that when we're in this room, we hear there's no problem, we're doing everything right, and everything's running smooth. But I'm sorry, but that is not the emails, and that is not the information we have. Just at the last assembly meeting, we had a gentleman who was up there. Remember the guy who owned investment properties and tried to do stuff and said his contractors, and the nightmares of getting permits and getting approvals and stuff getting delayed? You guys remember? He actually showed up at a work session yesterday as well. So I'm trying to figure out how do we fix this problem, because on one side I hear that there's not an issue, but then I'm getting floods of information from the public saying there is. So what is the truth? Thank you.
We have member Constant on the queue, and then member Brawley after. Member Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I actually don't have any communications from that appraiser per Bjorn-Roley. I've looked, and there's nothing. But that's kind of not germane to what I wanted to say. It's an interesting framing to say home inspectors are allowed to be done independently. That's true, and home inspections aren't actually required under the transfer rules for most lenders and for most processes. It's mostly a service a buyer does for themselves. So maybe a cognate might be in the construction industry, hiring someone to ensure that you received the boards you wanted, the nails were the quality you wanted when you bought them, that kind of thing. It's an internal position, really, or it's a service to the person who's seeking the sale. The appraiser, on the other hand, after 2008, the law changed, and an appraiser cannot work for the buyer. You can't have your own appraisal, and the seller either. It has to be independent, meaning hands free arm's length from either party to the transaction, the lender is the one, according to the law, who gets to choose who the appraiser is. So there are protections that have evolved over time to ensure that there is an arm's length enough relationship that the true record is established, that there isn't really the opportunity for the crafting of behind-the-scenes deals of parties who are working together, who have a business relationship. Because we know that that's why the law changed. That in the appraisal world before 2008, you had appraisers working with buyers or sellers to either pump up the values or reduce the values to make it where the business interest was at, not where the actual value was at. So I don't know that it's fair to kind of compare home inspectors to the inspection and the plan review process that we have at the municipality, because that is supposed to be independent.
Thank you, Member Constant. Member Bro?
Yeah, well, first, I appreciate Member Constance's comments about how to make it truly independent, because I think that is important, and that would be true for the current program we have. I guess the question I have for staff, because I'm thinking back to I think it was just 2 weeks ago that we talked about this, and the conversation at that time, if I recall, was that this could be valuable, that it's already working well on the residential side. There were concerns, I think that was maybe the conversation last month around staffing generally and low staffing, and a lot of concerns about the potential bottlenecks. And then also, Ross, you had mentioned that you would have potentially a document to share, and there was discussion about going further than just plan review. So I guess I'm trying to, and maybe this is also where Kevin was going, trying to square that conversation we had 2 weeks ago with what we're hearing now, which is different. And I agree with Mr. Johnson. I don't necessarily, this isn't for me coming from an ideology that I want to change this, or I want everything to be third party in the municipality, but I'm trying to understand how we fix the problems that we keep hearing about. And I keep hearing different things, again, in this room week to week or month to month. And so I guess that's where I ask, like how does what we've heard just now compare with what the conversation that we just had 2 weeks ago or a month ago? And then is there a need for a third party? Has the building department been working on, or the building team been working on an ordinance that we heard was drafted? Kind of where are we? I guess that's what I'm asking. Because that really is the basis for what we need to do, whether we try to do this or not, and then what it looks like, whether it's temporary or potentially permanent.
Do you have a target for that question?
Well, I guess it would be Ross. I know he's working on the computer, but I want to understand, because not long ago you said you had an ordinance and you said that you were contemplating going further than this third-party plan review as an option beyond the kind of typical municipal process. So that's what I just want to understand. Do we have a problem or not? Do we have a solution or not?
So whether a problem exists is subjective. It's kind of the eye of the beholder. We did draft an alternate ordinance. If the assembly is like, okay, we need third-party plan review, that's where we're going to go. I got together with my staff, and we drafted an ordinance that we felt would like to legitimize the process as best it could be and still have a reasonable process. It doesn't go further than plan review. It's just plan review.
When would we be able
Yeah, is there a time when you can see, are we pulling that up now?
I was attempting to here on the world's slowest computer.
All right. Yeah, well, bring a project forward. I think I identified that as a potential issue.
Well, and I guess, again, if residential third-party review, it was stated, it was either 2 weeks ago or last month, that is working. So if we have low demand, but that already exists, that's I think, and that's maybe what Member Johnson was trying to get at. Like, we keep hearing these things, and we basically hear two different stories, so it's really hard for us to tell. I'm not characterizing this as the assembly or members of the assembly just want to do this in a vacuum. It's really, we're trying to solve problems, which is that we're not building enough things, or we're hearing that it's expensive and very time-consuming to do. And I know that's not just on the regulatory process. There's a lot of factors there. you know, and if we're also thinking that that we haven't even bottomed out on the amount of construction we have in a year, that is a problem, because we're hoping that we see an increase and not a decrease. And so, again, you know, I'm really trying to figure out, do we need this, and just looking for guidance, and it feels like we hear different things from meeting to meeting.
All right, so there's a presentation being brought onto the screen, our screen here, and can you tell us what this is?
Okay, so this is our alternate version of a potential third-party plan review.
All right, for the sake of time, I just wanted to make sure that this is being introduced to us at this particular time, at this moment. You're not going to have a thorough reading of it at this time, and we're not going to thoroughly vet this, but can we make this available to the committee?
I could probably go through it in like 10 minutes and explain the differences between this and the current.
Yeah, I mean, I can do that. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, let's get a high level if we can. Thank you, Ross.
I emailed this.
Appreciate it.
So, point of information, is this presentation on the website, or has it been distributed? So for us who are on the phone following along,
It
we
is
can see it
currently
as well?
made available, thank you for the question, it is currently made available on our CDC website, and it's just been emailed out to members. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
So, in the proposed ordinance, there's two separate sections. There's one for the existing residential plan review, and then there's a new section for the commercial plan review. All right? So, since they're so similar, we just combine them into one for wordiness and simplicity. That opening general paragraph there is pretty much the same in both versions. And the exclusions, the exclusions right here, in the version proposed by Mr. Cross, he references a definition that's in the Architects, Engineering, and Land Surveyors Regulation. And the purpose of that definition is to distinguish between when a civil engineer can design a building and when a structural engineer is required to design a building. Okay, and rather than us just reference that definition in state regulation, we spell it out here. So basically, according to the engineering regulations, a civil engineer cannot design a risk category 3 or 4 building. It has to be a licensed structural engineer. Okay, and this was a recommendation by the Structural Engineers Association of Alaska. They did not want civil engineers designing risk category 3 and 4 buildings, which are like your hospitals, your buildings that if they were to collapse, you'd have substantial loss of life type of buildings. They also reference structures exceeding 100 feet and normally occupied structures that are more than 4 stories or 45 feet above grade plane. This number 4 is something we threw in. And this pulls municipal structures out of the ordinance. This exception would likely satisfy risk management that municipal buildings are undergoing municipal plan review and they're not undergoing private plan review. So that's what those exclusions are. Oh, would you please? The big difference, a big difference, is we've opened it up to multiple disciplines, not just structural review, but architectural review, electrical review, and mechanical review. What we have excluded is fire review, and fire review is excluded because Anchorage is a deferred jurisdiction under the purview of the state fire marshal. We cannot defer our fire review. Per our deferral agreement, we have to perform fire review in-house. Please scroll. And so we've added reviewer qualifications. And so what's going on here is the reviewers basically have to be pre-qualified and on a list. And if you're a builder or a developer and you want a private sector person to do your review, you got to pick a reviewer off the list, right? And so that allows us to have a little bit of oversight over the reviewers. The qualifications are not very onerous. 5 years of structural engineering experience. It takes 5 years of experience just to sit for the PE exam. The architectural review, we're requiring either an architect or an ICC building plans examiner. That's a pretty low bar. All you got to do to be an ICC building plans examiner is pass one simple test. So if the assembly wanted to tighten that up, that's fine. Okay, scroll down a couple more. So similarly for electrical review, we spell out the requirements and mechanical, plumbing, and fuel gas review, and then go down a little bit further. And then we define the process, kind of outline how it would work. Got to select the reviewer off the list. Some little the conflict of interest provisions that already exist in the current ordinance. The reviewer's got to be hired by the owner or the owner's authorized agent. That really doesn't change anything from the current process for a residential builder, because the residential builder is he either owns it or he's the authorized agent. The applicant, you just designate it on the application that you're taking this approach. We want the reviews to be finalized when you submit for the permit. Don't give us a partial submittal. Give us a complete submittal, basically. And that the reviewers will, basically, the approved version of the plans will be stamped. This isn't in current code. Change orders and deferred submittals is just kind of an oversight. We've thrown it in there to call out that any change orders or deferred submittals to the project would then go back through the reviewers. We've added more detail to a letter of review. So with each review that comes in, the reviewer is going to have to provide a letter of review, and we want a description of the scope of review and a description of how their experience is relevant to what they reviewed, right? Because getting back to engineering, civil engineering is a very broad field of work. At least half the civil engineers in the world don't know structural engineering. They do different type of engineering. So just because you have a PE in civil engineering in no way, shape, or form means you're qualified to review a building. We want them to turn in the list of deficiencies and the corrections made to legitimize the process, right? Okay, you did this review. What were your review comments? How were they resolved? A statement of review accepting responsibility, that's in current code. And the statement of indemnification or whatever, that's in current code. The waiver of claims is in current code. Go ahead and scroll down further. Restriction of authority is in current code. And this basically means the reviewers cannot approve alternate means and methods and code modification. Only the building official can do that. The auditing provision, this is in current code, but we added this part where the building official shall audit a minimum of 10%. We get lazy. If we don't have to do it, we don't do it. So if you make us do it, we're going to do it, type of thing. And then the revocation of privilege. If someone's faking it, they get pulled off the list of approved reviewers.
Not honest on their application.
Yeah, exactly. So any questions?
I have 2 people in the queue already. So Member Johnson and then Member Constance. Member Johnson?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first I'll ask sort of rhetorically. I'd just be curious to hear from the people who have been, sponsoring the original ES version, if they feel like this would sort of, how closely does this meet their goals? Like, do they think it'll achieve the desired effect? And then my more specific question for Ross. So on the first page at the bottom, point 4, and you mentioned it briefly, but I'd just like to give you a little bit more. Building and structures owned or leased by the municipality of Anchorage, including the Anchorage School District, would not be optional for third-party review. So can you just expand a little bit more why we would allow commercial structures but not community-owned structures to go through this process?
Yeah. So obviously, the assembly could delete that provision if they wanted to. with the original residential one that went through like 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, it seems like to me that this would be a good question for risk management to weigh in on, right?
I'd be curious to hear. I mean, I would.
Given the MOA self-insured and, yeah.
I mean, so if we're sort of tacitly acknowledging that going through third-party plan review creates more risk, you know, in terms of the quality or durability of the structure, then I think that's a bit of a flag. And if we think it's actually not a problem, they'll get the same sort of quality, then why include this statement? So I guess I would be kind of curious to hear risk management's take. But frankly, I think it feels a little funny to me to say that, you know, for everyone else it's fine, but for our building, we don't think this is sufficient.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good point that you pointed out, that we do perceive this as being more risky.
Thank you, Member Johnson. I have Member Cross. Constant on the phone, and then we have a stack with Member Myers as well.
Thanks. So my question is for Mr. Risbald. Ross, you ended on there was a certain action that would have one of these individuals removed from the list. So, and that was actually my question from before. My experience with, say, contractors apply for a license at the state, and the muni just kind of lets it go. And it's nearly impossible. Only once in my life have I seen the state remove an actual contractor from the contractor list. And so my question is, what is the methodology for the removal of a bad contractor? Does it go to a hearing officer? Is it one of these things that is hidebound in process and is going to take a year and a half, and they're going to be able to continue doing their work while we have evidence that they have already missed the mark in some way? What's the process?
So basically, if someone were removed from the list, that would be an action by the building official, a decision made by the building official, which would be appealable to the building board of examiners and appeals. So that would be the process and the recourse.
But what are the standards? What are the items that qualify a person for removal? Is it simply the whim of the building official, or are there certain benchmarks or kind of code provisions that have to be met to move someone to that list? Because, again, my experience with the muni is that there's nothing anyone could do short of murdering someone or causing a building to fall on their head before they get taken off the list of business interest. And so I don't find a lot of effective management of those kind of issues. So what are the things? What are the triggers?
Well, so the way we wrote it, we've made it easy to pull someone off the list, right? And the triggers would be, I've seen this happen, so when it happens, it's obvious. The triggers are when someone says they've done a review, but they have not done a review. And then the problems generally could either manifest themselves in the field during inspections, or they would show up on an audit. Sometimes they're so obvious that they actually show up during the pre-screen when the project comes in for permit.
Thank you, Member Constant. Member Myers?
Yes, so a question. You and Mr. Johnson mentioned this as well, incurs more risk. How do you see this incurring more risk? I'm just curious if the current reviewers in the MOA staff meet all these same qualifications.
Oh, experience-wise, the current reviewers all have way more experience than the minimums that are set there, right? With the current setup, we have a lot of control over the process. Everybody works in a very close, tight environment. They're bouncing ideas off each other. We're working very closely with the inspectors. We've got a very tight grip on the process right now of architectural plan reviews, fire plan reviews, structural plan reviews, and whatnot. When we start opening this up and bringing in all these additional people that we have no sort of supervisory authority over, you're kind of just loosening up the whole process and creating the opportunity for shenanigans to some degree.
I guess if I were a professional engineer, though, I wouldn't want to put my license on the line or my livelihood and push something through that wasn't that didn't meet the standards it should.
And that's a good point, and that's you. But I had, a while back, I had an architect who was rubber stamping plans. He was not looking at them. They were being designed by a person who is not an architect. And all he was doing was putting his stamp. He was a licensed professional architect, rubber stamping. It was so blatantly obvious that I turned him into the ALS board, and they yanked his ability to seal drawings for about a year. So I don't know why people want to put engineers and professionals up on a pedestal, but they're just people like everybody else, and there's professionals out there that are competent and ones that are incompetent, and there's
Right,
guys
but
that
I think you find that in any profession.
yeah, exactly.
In here,
Yeah.
and in the building.
So that's why I'm saying, if you're, and I'm not opposed to these qualifications at all. I don't want to take it that way, but I'm just wondering how, and I guess I can see both sides of this. That you feel there's a level of risk when you turn it over to a professional engineer to a plan review, but I feel like the same thing could happen here if it's a Friday afternoon on a long weekend and somebody wants to get out of here, and you've got the builder calling because they're pissed off because they've been delayed. So we stand and push it through. I mean, I can see that either way.
Yeah. I guess my point is that we have better control over the people that work directly under us for us.
I have a few folks in the queue, but Council Gates, he wanted to chime in.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask while you were on it, the number 4 exclusion. And I guess I wondered about the risk, but also I wondered, this is just the plan review portion. So a lot of municipal structures, we bid out work, the design work, the construction work, and so forth. And so we continue to do that. This is just saying you can't do plan review as part of the design RFP. Like, I guess to me it seems if the municipality or school district is the owner of the property and we do an RFP or an ITB for design of one of our municipal buildings, you could decide at that point in time, with the ITB, it can't include plan review, we have to do it internally, as opposed to putting it in code for every project for earlier or after. And you can do it one project at a time as an administrative decision to the, I guess, procurement for the work. So I just wondered if you thought about the 2 approaches to take and why this one seemed better. I guess you mentioned risk.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're 100% correct, Dean. The school district or whatever could decide, whether or not they want their buildings to go through private plan review or muni plan review. We don't see this provision being any sort of showstopper or anything. It just...
We have
I did have a couple if I could. About supervision of plan reviewers, and I understand here we're in the building together and we work together often. It may be a little easier to coordinate, I guess, your comments or responses or whatever. But the ordinance, well, this is the first time I've seen this, so I think you have auditing the independent plan review plans that are stamped. You have the ability to audit them 20% or so forth. You could just select all of those plans that are stamped by a third party to audit. And doesn't that save the reviewers time from doing the whole thing themselves? They could just audit the ones that are municipal buildings as another alternative, I guess.
It would save the municipality time in the sense that we're not doing full plan reviews on these ones that are being privately done.
I apologize. I'm sort of thinking out loud. I wouldn't normally do that in a county meeting and brainstorming about different approaches. I did wonder another thing. As I said, it's the first time I've seen this. So this isn't all structural plan review only for commercial structures. Did I understand that right? So both residential and commercial could have independent plan review. Not them municipal buildings, but others. For you had mechanical and plumbing and electrical. And that would apply to commercial structures as well.
Correct. Yeah, it applies to commercial structures except risk category 3 and 4 structures, really tall structures, and these normally occupied buildings 4 or more stories.
So in that sense, it's much broader for commercial construction than the original in the S version that we have that was only authorized in structural plan review.
Correct.
And then I missed at the beginning, I guess, this drafting. I mean, I just read the header, and it's got the sponsors, but is this going to be submitted for the addendum? And is that also from Mr. Cross and Salty? Or
Oh, I haven't thought through any of that. That would work.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. We have two other members in the queue. The final members in the queue are the two members that are brought actions forward today, Mr. Cross and Member Brawley. So we'll go to Mr. Cross.
I like this. I mean, I'd like to chew on it a little bit more, but I like that it expands, which honestly was the direction I was going anyway. I wasn't going to stop the structural. I wanted to work with it. So this opens it up to more, expands the reviewing process. And it also speaks to my S version, which is the S version I had, which was trying to define the criteria, or is there a qualification, and writing that out and being more specific about the qualifications of being an approved third-party plan reviewer, which I think in the original S version was vague. It just met the state licensing requirements, et cetera. But hey, number of years in work, and I see Anna put that into hers as well, which is for structural. I think it was significant structures. I think 5 years. Forgive me, I don't have it in front of me, but so the service, I like this, and so if this gets us to where the problem we're trying to solve, but also solves a couple others, and it's something that the planning department is more can swallow easier. I wouldn't have any problem working on something like that. I just need, like I said, we're just seeing it today for the first time, so I just need to chew on it for a little bit. But I really appreciate you putting something together and coming. Honestly, I really appreciate when you are proactive problem solvers and say, here's a way to do this, so that it's not completely driven from the assembly, which is frustrating for two parts, because one, you don't appreciate us telling you how to do your job, and we don't want to feel like we're forcing something down your throat that you're being forced to chew on and swallow. So to have you provide this and move forward with it is greatly appreciated. A couple things though that we had, which is I just want to make sure I understand. With buildings and structures owned or leased by municipality acreage, ultimately you're going to run into a situation, whether it's a school or something, that, listen, we have to acknowledge that at some point you're going to get a set of plans before you that the individuals, even though they may be highly qualified in your community, it may be something they haven't dealt with before. And so when that happens, do you not go hire third-party contractors to assist you in those disciplines that you haven't done?
Boy, that hasn't come up in years.
Well, I would think it would happen. I mean, I would think that for the private sector and whatever it is, my understanding is it is happening in the private sector where they're getting stuff before you. Those are the emails, things that you haven't seen. They have somebody, or they have a third-party engineer that has years of experience in this, and that's where these long delays are drawn out. I mean, if it's something we've done 100 times, I think that you guys can probably go through it pretty quick. But what I'm seeing here, and we go and dig into that a little bit deeper, but that's the ideal situation for allowing for independent third-party reviews and types of construction that are not standard. And then I guess you had said there, Kylie, has there ever been a time in plan review where the individuals that we had, just because of lack of employees, lacked sufficient qualification for the plan reviews? Has there ever been a time where we had people reviewing plans that were PEs or weren't certified?
Oh yeah. We've had non-PE. There's no requirement to be a PE to be a plan review. Or
an architect, or I guess I'm just looking because, again, we're going to hold this standard to the third party. I just want to make sure that we're always, what happens in a case that you lose one of your highly qualified? What happens here if we were to lose it? We have employee retention problems. If you were to lose some of those key individuals that have that profound industrial knowledge or industry knowledge, what is the plan to pick up for that? You're probably going to have to hire a third party. Would be my imagine. So I'm like, do you see where it goes? I mean, we're here, we're trying to get here, but it just seems like whenever we run into a situation where if we have a lack of employees where we lose somebody who's highly qualified, or the public is trying to do something, I just see it going directly. But as far as this, I really like this, and I'm going to have to dig into it a little bit more. And Ross, I really appreciate you putting it forward.
Thank you for bringing it forward today, Ross. And I think there's more work to do. Final comments on this from Member Brawl.
Yeah, just really briefly. So I know Kevin and I and Randy haven't had a chance to talk in detail, so we can keep working on this. As I said, I am interested in this only as a time-limited thing, at least to test it out if we do move forward with this. I appreciate the alternative ideas. I did ask Mandy to send around the definition of significant structures, because I think it seems to be broader than this, but I like the idea of a public facility staying within public review. I think the point about the risk is essentially, it's a legal issue that if you don't go through the meeting process exactly, you would be taking on that risk. I don't know if it's a structural risk versus a liability legal issue. And then lastly, I think it's a question, should we have third-party review? So if we're hearing that it does increase risk, then why do we have it for residential? But what I've also heard is it's working for residential. So I think we should think about treating that consistently and then exempting or not allowing it for buildings that are significant or have those characteristics, whatever it is. And then one quick question for Ross. In this, going back to Mr. Constance's point, rather than the person, the project owner doing the review, does this contemplate the muni would have a pool of contractors or like who would be deciding who could do this review beyond the qualifications?
So the private sector people would submit applications and resumes to us to get on the list.
Okay.
As a structural, architectural, or whatever, we would review them. If they met the qualifications, they go on the list. This isn't something we just pulled out of the air. We're already doing a similar process in the on-site water and wastewater section, where the installers are pre-qualified and on a list.
So just to say, I think there's some areas that we can keep working on, how we're meeting the concerns that raised.
Great, and I hope that folks will work on this, like Member Cross mentioned, so that we can have another version come forward. Mr. Constant,
Yeah, Mr. Martinez.
I will defer to the chair, Mr. Constant, for 1 second. Hold on.
Thank you.
For a invitation and connection to tomorrow's work session, and then keep it short, please.
Yeah, thank you. And just, there's a substantial difference between a list of people who do contracting work like installing versus those who do for us inspections and reviews. So I want to make sure people understand there is a big difference between those two things. But tomorrow, when I'm looking at my calendar, we're having a work session at 1 o'clock relating to the municipality's hiring process. It's the first of a series of work sessions with the HR department. And one of the questions that I've asked is for a detailed list of all of the hiring notices for the permitting desk. And so tomorrow we should have an opportunity to understand if the problem of recruiting and staffing the permitting desk is a problem of we're not able to find employees or we're not actually seeking them, which I think is a very important question. So that'll be tomorrow's work session.
Thank you for the promo and the introduction for tomorrow. Thank you, Ross, for bringing this forward and for explaining that. Thank you, members, for the discussion. If people have additional comments and feedback, please send it forward to the co-sponsors of this, and hopefully we'll be able to see a version back before this committee to vet at a near future meeting. On that note, we'll move to the next agenda item. This is Member Cross is going to lead us on a conversation on amending open space requirements. He mentioned it last meeting, and he's bringing something forward today. Thank
Yeah,
you.
actually, this was brought to me by Craig Lyons. So this is a conversation that I had with Craig and Mr. Whitfield probably about 7 months ago. There was a list of concerns we got from private developers saying, here are some things to consider. We had mentioned eliminating the open space requirement specifically for multifamily properties, larger multifamily properties that are within a quarter mile of a school or a public park. And so, actually, since this was drafted and created from the planning department through conversations that we generated, I support it. I wanted to see if there was any questions, concerns. Anybody from the planning department want to talk about this AO? Dave, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Dave Whitfield, Planning Department. This ordinance takes it actually a step further from what Member Cross had spoke about with respect to exempting the private open space requirements for multifamily development.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I can barely hear Dave. Can you move closer to the microphone?
I'll speak louder. This ordinance goes a step further with respect to private open space than just exempting those multifamily development projects that are in close proximity to parkland or schools. What it does is it reduces the minimum private open space in our multifamily residential districts. If everyone has the ordinance available, if I could direct you to page 2, starting on line 24 in the R2M district. It's not underlined here, but it reduces the minimum square footage for multifamily development projects, providing from 400 square feet per dwelling unit to 200 square feet. So it reduces it by 50%. And that is consistent with the R2M, R3, R3A, R4A, R4, and then multifamily development projects in our commercial districts. So what it does is it reduces the private open space by half in our multifamily districts for larger multifamily projects. And then on page 3, under exemptions, it exempts, because we just did the 3 and 4-plex project, it exempts multifamily dwellings with less than 5 units, so effectively treating 3 and 4-plexes like single and 2 family, and then also provides an exemption for residential development projects within 1/4 mile of a public school or dedicated parkland. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I have one question from Member Constant, who said they had to take off to a meeting, and then I have a two, which is how is 1/4 mile measured?
Oh.
Typically, it's straight line distance.
I don't know if that's the right answer, but I'm going to make sure that it's on the record. Typically straight line.
So this is right in with the planning department. I know this because of all the marijuana.
Yes.
So marijuana has its own specific set of criteria for measuring separation distance, but there is a standard rule for measuring distance between land uses that's already established in code in chapter 15 that does require a straight line. It is not as a crow flies. It is not.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, you can, Mr. Constant. It was your question I was advancing.
Yep. And I'm just last question then, Ryan. So straight line, what does that mean? Is this as the crow flies, like that kind of concept, or how is that specifically?
Through the chair, so the member concept would be property line to property line, straight line.
Right. So effectively, it could be way more than a 1/4 mile if the way that the roads are laid out to actually get access to the open space has to be navigated. Is that a fair assessment?
Through the chair, so Mr. Constant, are you referring to a straight line? It might be a 1/4 mile, but you'd have to like walk. If the way to get there would be longer than a 1/4 mile.
Yeah, exactly. So in the cannabis world, we have the 200 feet straight line, and then we have the plus how you actually get there has to be measured. And so really, I'm okay with this in principle, but I think the distance for some properties, if you're drawing a line from property line to property line, is way more than a 1/4 mile. I think that I just want to understand if my assumption is correct, because if you have to go 90 degrees forward for 50 feet and then turn left and go, etc., it's going to be more.
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, your assumption is correct. There could definitely be scenarios where straight line distance, it's a 1/4 mile or less, but then practically to walk there safely could be much longer than that.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Thank you.
Yeah, Member Brawl?
Yeah, I appreciate you guys bringing this forward. I guess I have a general question, which is more base assumptions. Why do we need open space requirements? So, and I understand the idea that people would want yards, but I also looking at the reality that many other places, and I'll use Chicago for example. There's a basic typology of apartments where you've got a courtyard. Most of the parcel is building. And granted, this was built before cars, right? So these are older, there's no parking in addition. There's a small courtyard in the middle. So what I'm seeing here is, so that's one question, is what is the purpose of these open space requirements versus not putting this as a requirement on multifamily, because we don't really put that on single family. We do have lot coverage requirements. And then also, what is the rationale for basically having a scale up per unit? Because what that does is the bigger the project, the more that you have to have versus, as I said, you could have a pretty dense building with a central courtyard. And I bring that up not because I don't believe people want green space, that is true, but also, I think we've seen a lot of examples, including across the street from me, where you've got this large green space that looks very nice, no one ever uses it except the people who are mowing it. And so I think there's a practical question of it sounds good on paper, but is this actually providing for people? And then also because it has the effect of reducing the number of buildings we can put on our property and the number of units we can put on our property. So I'm just kind of curious to back up from there. What is the purpose of open space requirements? Because I think that helps us understand what is an acceptable minimum that we would require.
Thank you, Member Brawley, for the questions and comments. We really appreciate it. Dave Whitfield, Planning Department again. And I'm going to read verbatim from code with respect to private open space. Private open space is intended to provide residents with the opportunities for active and passive outdoor recreation, relaxation, and enjoyment. And as such, those provisions apply. The minimum standard per unit already is in code today. Our intent, because of the conversations we had with Member Cross, conversations that we had with other members of the development community, were to reduce that standard. Certainly it's up to the Assembly to decide whether these standards are appropriate, and certainly you're welcome to revise as necessary. So that's where we're at. I appreciate your comments. This is an attempt to, as we were doing with triplexes and fourplexes, facilitate more development of multifamily housing.
Thank you. Is it in response to
Yes.
Ross?
Yeah, through the chair. As a practical matter right now, one of the issues we're running into is people who are trying to shovel the roofs are running out of space because of snow. And as a practical matter, you just need a certain amount of minimum space around your building when we have a winter like this to get the snow off your roof.
Thank you. Member Johnson?
I think Member Brawley asked some interesting questions. What I want to do, it's hard for me to kind of like sort of conceptualize, what does development look like with or without these restrictions? And I appreciate, the department putting this forward. In my mind, at least, this feels like a reasonable step. I've heard from builders that this has been a significant constraint, and it's really curtailed some projects and reduced the density or even the viability some. So this feels like probably a reasonable step forward. I'm a little. I guess I'd be a little hesitant, at least at this point, to say let's just do away with it entirely, because I can't quite conceptualize what the consequences of that would look like. I think my sort of more meaningful question, though, is Member Constant made an interesting point, on this variant about this exemption for the quarter-mile distance. So I guess, I feel like sort of the spirit of this is if people have easy enough access to public school or dedicated parkland, then they don't need the open space because it's readily accessible. Now, the quarter-mile straight line distance maybe doesn't always achieve that goal. So I guess I'm trying to think in my mind, is there an option? Would it be practical or permissible to say, well, it's going to be a quarter mile measured out by the actual distance it takes to walk? And if that's not doable, then, if the spirit of it is we want people to be within a quarter mile walking distance, do we just reduce this to say the straight line distance is, an eighth of a mile because, realistically that probably is a quarter mile walk most of the time? And then at what point, we made it so restrictive that really, like when we actually map this out in GIS, it's like, well, you're not really going to be able to do it anywhere because we've just constrained ourselves too much. I don't know. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, Brian, where we find the right balance there to achieve that goal, but not be overly, overly restrictive.
Yeah, through the chair, Brian Neal, Planning Department. Certainly the Assembly's got a couple different options with this one. You could reduce the straight line distance to sort of better ensure that it's practically closer to the site. You could make that separation distance shorter practical pedestrian route. You want to go that route, no pun intended, for to ensure that you can actually get there within a quarter mile. I will say the guidelines for how to measure shortest practical pedestrian route specific to marijuana facilities are quite complex. I'm probably the only one in the municipality that understands them, to be quite frank with you. There are guidelines where if you're on a major arterial, say you've got a marijuana facility and a park, and you have a major arterial that splits the two, you can't measure and assume that you can cross that major arterial at any intersection. You have to go to a signalized intersection. So that could increase your separation distance, short practical pedestrian route separation distance up to a half a mile, depending upon where you need to cross. So by having it straight line distance, it's a much simpler standard to understand and administer. But I do also get the concern of coming into it from a practical standpoint of, is this actually an acceptable distance, and will a resident, if it's over a quarter mile, if it's over half a mile, typically, and I'm thinking of how close a transit stop is, that can be the make or break whether or not somebody chooses to take transit, how far they have to walk. This could be a make or break whether or not somebody chooses to access that park and take their family there. So I don't really have a definitive answer for you, but these are all really good things to consider.
Just
go ahead.
No, David.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, and I don't want to make more work for very busy people. But I mean, how so we've seen some kind of neat GIS projects before where we sort of take certain features or zones and then we sort of draw sort of that quarter mile distance around it or whatever. Would it be, how hard would it be to do something like that? Because I would just be curious to have a visual aid, right? If I take the public school and the dedicated parkland in Anchorage and I draw a quarter mile around it or an eighth of a mile, how much space does it actually capture? Because again, if we whittle down to the point where we say it's got to be eighth of a mile, we draw it out, and we think, okay, great, this is a nice happy medium. There's few if any properties that actually meet that requirement. I just think it would be interesting. Again, it's an ask, not a directive, but if somebody has some time and knocks something like that up, I feel like it'd be informative.
Dave Whitfield, Planning Department again. Appreciate that. I think we can put together some GIS data that some mapping that would show you what a quarter mile from I think several schools perhaps or several parks in town, what that looks like. The 1/4 mile is not necessarily an arbitrary number that the planning department just grabbed. This is a number, a term that is commonly used in Title 21. So this is our first, I'll say, offering. We're certainly amenable to a different way of measuring or reduced distance. This is just our first attempt at solving this problem.
Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Member Folden?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, definitely. I appreciate this coming forward, and it. I'm supportive of it as is. Maybe we should have park supportive corridors in our updated land use plan. I don't know. So I think, it's interesting to me, remember Brawley's comments about, and Mr. Whitfield's response about the purpose statements of open space. It does unpack a lot of questions, I think, as sort of many of our assumptions in Title 21 do. do those assumptions in the purpose statements prove true? Are people using open space for recreation, etc.? I remember when I lived in Seattle, I lived in this historic building, beautiful old brick building in Capitol Hill called the Lenawee Apartments, and it was an L-shaped building, and in the crux of the L, there was this beautiful garden with these established rose bushes and got lots of sun, and nobody was ever back there. And then later moved into the Inner Bay area, big multifamily complex. I had a little studio apartment, and on the top of the roof, they had a really cool rooftop deck area, and a lot of people were always up there using that. So I wonder in the exemptions, because I see here in 5, any building floor area provided as indoor private open space that meets certain standards. I wonder if added to the exemption should be, if there's a multifamily that has like a rooftop open space, would that be counted as open space? I'm not sure how that currently works in code, so that's one question I have. And then, just thinking about like when people are looking for apartments or, housing in general, are they looking for open space? Like I'm always trying to think of what is like the hierarchy of needs when it comes to housing, right? And so like shelter, I think, is like the highest. And then like solar access, I don't know, maybe that's important. Maybe it's further on down the hierarchy. And is open space functionally, is it being used for the benefit of those who live on that property truly? Or is it being used sort of in deference to neighboring properties to provide, more space between neighbors or more solar access, etc.? And so anyway, those are questions on my mind. But I think, I guess my specific question would be rooftop open space. Is that a thing in code?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Code says that required private open space may be private yard, garden, patio, deck, balcony, and other open space reserved for use of the people dwelling there. So you can count those. Rooftop deck.
Awesome, thank you.
So a rooftop deck would count. We have Member Frost?
Yeah, I'm gonna make one comment, then I gotta run, I apologize. But, as far as the distance goes, and just 2 comments, it's gonna be the law of averages. You can have several properties where it's adjacent and they're not have to. And you may have some that it's on the outside of it, and walking may be a little bit more than half a mile. But I would encourage you all to go out and walk a half a mile and see what that feels like, and if that's a reasonable distance. Or if you,
Quarter mile?
quarter mile, thank you. A quarter mile, if it feels reasonable. A quarter mile is a pretty short, I would think by any stretch of the imagination.
5-minute walk.
5-minute walk. That's, okay, so it goes from 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, so I would think that the law of averages, I would see where it makes sense if you had a development and it's like, there's the new Seward Highway, right? And on the other side is your park, and technically it's a quarter mile away, but you have a major highway in between. I would think that would get red flagged, and I wonder if there isn't something that says, except in cases where a major artery, a major road, or something like that it interferes. So that's the one case where I can see it doesn't make sense. It's a quarter mile, but you have 4 lanes of highway, high-speed highway in between. So maybe that's something that we can adjust. But I think overall, what we're doing is that would be the exception. 99.9% of it would fall within, the other quarter mile requirement. And the other thing I had as far as open space requirements, it was just Cordova Square, which is on the corner of 11th and Cordova. They only have rooftop decks. Now, it's probably built before we had open space requirements, but they have all rooftop decks and nobody uses them. I know because I owned one of those. Except for you, do you use one occasionally?
Yeah, I barbecued with my friend.
All right, there you go. Were you the only ones up there?
10 or 15 years ago.
10 or 15 years ago, you're probably the only one there. So they're not used a whole lot, but I will tell you that one, although there's little to no open space, you probably couldn't build that development again. Those are very popular because they got elevators, and it's mostly older retired people or people who hate stairs who buy those underground garages and elevators in them. So again, they're serving a need. They don't have open space. It's an older demographic that isn't going to go out and play pickleball, right? And so, just looking at some of those open space requirements, and then finally on open space, I'm not against open space. In fact, I think it is unwise for a developer just to build all building and not put some green space, because I don't live in Alaska because I love looking at concrete and steel. I think that, there's landscaping requirements, and so that's my question for planning. Is there a difference between open space requirements and landscaping requirements? Do landscaping fall under open space? Is it combined? And does that make sense? I just want to make sure we don't, the public would be concerned we're just saying go build ugly buildings with no landscape.
Yeah, I mean, there are two distinctly different provisions of code. One addresses landscape requirements, the other open space. But in a lot of instances, you can combine or use the same area to meet different sections of code. And in this case, open space and landscaping could, I'll say, cohabitate or they can overlap.
All right, thank you. Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, just briefly, so I do, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of open space. I would be interested in addition to the per unit, having a square footage cap. And maybe that would differ by this. I see there's a 5%, but that still feels like a large area. And again, I'm coming from the basic urban development principle that we need to put more buildings on our land. We need to put more units per building where we can, not in every single place. And we need to have people living closer together, because that's how we have transit, that's how we have walkability. That is how we transform our basically suburban development pattern into a more urban development pattern, which is what our comp plan says, and it is what we need to do as a city to survive, basically. We cannot sustain the way we've been built. And so I know that that's much bigger than this thing, but when you look at what you require, in addition to lot coverage, in addition to the landscaping requirements, this is something to think about, is how much we are putting, again, that value of everybody having a yard, basically, and I understand some of this could be indoor, it could be other forms, not just green space on the ground, but we have to balance that against the idea of having affordability, having density in certain areas, and again, having density to support our economy, our transit, and basically the thresholds of number of people you need to make the city function. So that's where I'm interested in maybe going further with this, but I'll follow up, so I appreciate this as a good start.
I think what I heard in what you said is there's a view that if there's required site perimeter landscaping or parking lot interior landscaping, then there should not be a requirement for open space. And just because you'd be required to have a landscape easement of some shrubs or something along the perimeter of a property, that's not usable space that's intended by this. Now, you can have the view that that individual properties should not be required to provide any open space because they already have, maybe a landscape requirement, but that's not what's in code.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not arguing that the landscaping itself is sufficient for what it's trying to do. What I'm saying is how much do you have building versus non-building on the property? Because I think we also have the issue on unmanaged landscaping that either doesn't get trimmed, it dies off because it's not maintained. I mean, there's a lot of other issues to unpack there, but the general principle is how do we get more buildings on our land?
Great. This is a great piece of code changes moving forward, so I think this has been a really good, fruitful conversation. I just wanted to put a couple of comments on it as well. One of the most interesting things about development when we talk about it is that we're really competing with all sorts of assumptions across time that have changed fundamentally. And so we have a community that has invested an immense amount of resources and visibility on green spaces, trails, and we celebrate and promote the fact that we have these things for our community. This is an attractive draw to our community, but there's also kind of a counter argument that, well, if people are not using them, then what good is it? And a lot of what we talk about is anecdotal. A lot of what we talk about is not necessarily data driven. And so when people talk about, do people utilize, and this is not a critique, it's just an observation. I lived in Greenbrier. Everybody know what Greenbrier is? It's a Widener property?
Yeah.
Everybody has a little balcony small, tiny balcony, and a little open space for where you walk your dogs out in the green patch out there. Because, you know, those are little amenities that serve the purpose of people that needed those particular things. Now, that's in the practical living of it. In the design of the building, it's considered probably open spaces, right? And so, do you know how many people with dogs will utilize that as their dog run? Who knows? But it's designed in these ways. But when the argument is made that, well, people don't tend to not use these spaces, so what good is they? What good are they? Well, let's be real careful about that, because a lot of people don't use the trails. I would say most people in Anchorage don't use the trail system overall, because we have 300,000 people, or less, a little less than that, in Anchorage overall in the municipality. And do we have a data on how many trail users are here? It's not going to be 100,000 people from our city. So it's an interesting way to think about the data when we think about open spaces and the quality of life to people in their building, in their accessibility, the way it's written in code. Whether they use those things or not, how are we measuring that in fact? Or are we just willing to use what we see observably into our decision making? I don't see people using the open spaces, and so therefore it's not an addition to their quality of life. And I think that those are really dangerous assumptions, primarily because the maintaining open space in the first place creates a different psychological relationship to whether you use it or not. And so it's just an interesting conversation. I love the idea of the way rooftops have been utilized, but a lot of these things happen because people just are innovating and evolving to their own practical use, more than that there are designs in place for people should be compelled to use rooftops, for example. And so I just want to make sure that we're really checking all of the assumptions and trying to, as best as we can, back things up with data. One thing I would like to ask in terms of this question is, I'm interested in actionable things that take us from, so we've created opportunity to see, let's just use these conversations today, here in this one, open space, for multifamily residential, in a distance to parks, and using Member Johnson's idea of the mapping of it, right, to see. I'm interested then in saying, what can the municipality do if we have those data points to incentivize multifamily development in those corridors where they overlay with all of these great variables that we are geolocating, and then say, well, now what is the incentivization program to do that there, target and get some growth? Is there anybody willing to bite on those investment apples? I'm interested in figuring out that type of strategy. Right now, I don't see how, unless you know where money is going to be focused and targeted, I don't see how we're creating necessarily a real drive toward some of the things that we're articulating we want, like multifamily in these particular corridors where we have accessibility to parklands and not necessarily need open space. That sounds like, well, how do we incentivize building there? Is this these new tax incentives or abatement zones that we're talking about? Are there new funding strategies that we can really drive so that we overlay all of these ideas with, okay, now here's a window where we can see if somebody wants to actually invest in these corridors, because we want investment in these corridors. So I would love to see projects come forward on top of these ideas that not only create space, but create opportunities for real investment so that we can, because I don't think you can dangle over the head of investors. Look what we did with open spaces. Look what we did with, and maybe there's some argument that look what we did with parking minimums. Now we're an attractive city to invest in. But it seems that the tax incentives, the other ways and other strategies have to be part of the conversation. That's what Mike Robbins has been focused on. That's what we're doing in the downtown corridors. So how can we bring that as an overlay to this conversation is important. I have a final comment on this from Mr. Voland, and then we'll open it up for any public comments, and we'll close on time so that people can get to the next committee meeting at 1:55. Mr. Voland?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I definitely agree with you on the need for more data when we're making these decisions. and that we should, we all have our experience and backgrounds, and, we can bring our own anecdotes into the conversation. I guess what I'm concerned with is the lack of data that informs some of our current code. When we, for instance, to your point, when we looked at parking minimums, those were not minimums that were created, in response to data. Many of them were arbitrary, four bowling lanes for every, or one parking spot for every 4 bowling lanes. Actually, I think it's the opposite, 4 parking spots for every 1 bowling lane. These are things that are in code, and, whether it's a purpose statement or, the amount of room dedicated to open space, I think that these are things that we need to be able to challenge the assumptions that we have in code, and that is, it cuts both ways. It's equally dangerous not to challenge some of these assertions and see, are these things serving us as a community or not when it comes to addressing our lack of housing and our need to develop acreage. So yeah, I guess I just want to say that I appreciate the need for more data on a lot of this stuff, but I want to, one thing that I'm interested in, for instance, I want to bring a white paper forward soon to CEDC on the transit supportive corridors in the 2040 land use plan, because I do not think the transit supportive corridors, as outlined in our plan, are doing what they would purport to do. A lot of our residential zoning around our, quote, transit supportive corridors is actually very low density. So anyway, I think now is the time to really drill down on a lot of this stuff and be informed by the data, to your point, and make informed decisions going forward. And some of that's going to be right-sizing code. Some of it's going to be maybe reversing code. So anyway, yeah, great discussion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Volan. Are there any members of the public here who would like to make comments? Seeing none, we will adjourn at 10:28. Thank you, everyone.